People first came to this land about 20,000 years ago. Ancient rock paintings tell us they hunted wild animals and gathered fruits and seeds. Then, about 9,000 years ago, they learned how to raise crops. For the next 6,000 years, most of these people farmed the rich volcanic soil of what would someday be known as central and southeastern Mexico. Then, about 3,000 years ago, one group of these people, the Olmecs, began to develop an advanced society ruled by priests and kings. As with some other ancient Indian groups, the Olmecs built large flat-topped pyramids with temples on them and studied the heavens. The Olmecs, who lived in a southeastern area bordering what is today called the Gulf of Mexico, developed a sophisticated counting system. Among other things, the system was used to create a stone calendar that could accurately predict lunar and solar eclipses and the movement of planets. The Olmecs sculpted huge stone heads that were transported from one area to another by boat. They even made pull toys for their children. Later, another great civilization, that of the Mayans, emerged. Archaeological sites tell us that at its height, between 1,700 and 1,100 years ago, Mayan cities were located throughout what is known today as the Yucatan Peninsula. The Mayans produced remarkable architecture and art. They also made important advances in astronomy and mathematics. This is a replica of a Mayan calendar. They also were the first Native Americans to develop an advanced system of writing. The Mayans worshipped a sun god, Kinich, a moon goddess, Ixchel, and a maize god, Amun, along with some 160 other deities. As Mayan civilization began to decline, another, that of the Toltecs, began to emerge in an area just north of where Mexico City is found today. The Toltecs were known as the master builders. They constructed large stone buildings and created a society ruled by warrior kings. The greatest of the Toltec warrior rulers was Quetzalcoatl, which means great green bird snake. Despite its great warriors, however, the Toltec Empire lasted only about 300 years, eventually falling to nomadic peoples who from time to time invaded from the north. One group of those invaders was the Aztecs. They were fierce warriors who raided farming communities and enslaved those whom they captured. But the Aztecs also laid claim to or built two of the world's largest cities at that time. One, called Teotihuacan, once had some 200,000 people. Teotihuacan was a major religious and commercial center for hundreds of years, and its buildings were engineering marvels. But to the south, it was the Aztecs' capital city, Tenochtitlan, that was one of the true engineering and architectural stars of the ancient world. As this 16th century map shows, Tenochtitlan was built on an island in Lake Texcoco and had giant causeways that linked it to the mainland. Tenochtitlan had wide streets laid out in a grid pattern, as well as canals. The people highlighted are walking along one of those waterways. Like Teotihuacan seen here, Tenochtitlan had huge pyramids topped with temples where sacrifices, animals, vegetables, minerals, and humans were offered to the Aztec gods. The Aztecs were a very religious people. Like the Mayans, they had many gods, including an adaptation of the Toltec ruler Quetzalcoatl, who was now seen as the god of civilization and learning. the Aztec Empire lasted some 200 years. Perhaps it would have lasted much longer were it not for the revolts staged by angry subjects and the arrival of Europeans who sailed to North America in the late 1400s and early 1500s. A Spanish explorer, Francisco de Cordoba, landed on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517. He reported back to the Spanish governor in Cuba, Diego Velázquez, that this previously unknown land had large cities and possibly treasure. Another explorer, Juan de Grijalva, came the following year. When the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II heard reports of these foreigners, he concluded they must be gods, like Quetzalcoatl. For these beings seemed to be attached to strange four-legged creatures and had devices that shot thunder and flashes of lightning at their foes. Then another Spaniard, Hernán Cortés, along with 650 of his own men and thousands of Indians who were the Aztecs' enemies, marched into Aztec lands and soon defeated a large Aztec army. Moctezuma sent gifts to the foreign invader as a friendly gesture. But the ruler also ordered Cortés to leave Aztec lands. Cortés ignored the orders and headed toward Tenochtitlan, bullying and then signing on more Indians as allies along the way, those who hated the Aztecs for taking their corn and sacrificing their relatives atop the pyramids. When he arrived at Tenochtitlan, Cortés was allowed to enter without resistance, because the Aztecs still believed the Spanish were gods, and Cortés, the great god Quetzalcoatl. It did not take the Aztecs long to discover their mistake, for shortly after arriving, Cortés and his men seized the king and held him hostage. The following year, the Aztecs revolted, and the Spanish were forced to flee. But they returned to the capital a year later and blocked the causeways that led to the city, as well as the aqueducts that carried fresh water to its citizens. With no food and fresh water, the Aztecs finally surrendered, and Cortés named King Charles of Spain ruler of these New World lands. The king's representatives in the New World, such as Altamirano Velasco, shown here, and Roman Catholic archbishops, let the Indians speak their own languages and let native rulers govern their people. But the local population had to convert to Roman Catholicism wherever the Spanish gained military control. Moreover, corn and labor had to be given to the Spaniards instead of to the Aztecs. Corn and labor helped people of Spanish heritage in the New World, or Creoles, become a wealthy elite class. Indians were used as laborers on large estates, or haciendas, that many Creoles built. Life in the haciendas was markedly better than in the fields. Many Creole families lived in ornate splendor. But then, when the Spanish king, Charles III, took away many of their powers in the late 1700s, this elite class began talking about independence. In 1810, the talk turned into an open revolt. 11 years later, Mexicans found themselves citizens of an independent nation. By 1824, the new country had its first president, Guadalupe Victoria, and a newly adopted constitution. But conflict returned in the 1830s, when Mexico fought to keep its territory in the north. First, it fought Texans who claimed Mexican lands. Then border clashes erupted between U.S. and Mexican forces when Texas became part of the United States in 1845. Once again, the dispute concerned land. The clashes escalated until the United States declared war on Mexico in 1846. In 1847, the U.S. Army attacked and then captured Mexico City. The war ended shortly after that, and Mexico surrendered half its territory to the U.S. Ongoing struggles, often with armed civilians ready to do battle against the government, marked much of Mexican history during the last half of the 19th century. On one side were small farmers who wanted power shifted from the central government to the state governments. On the other side were central government soldiers, officials, the church, and many wealthy landowners. After President Francisco Madero was assassinated in 1911, a bloody revolution broke out. There were many revolutionary heroes, but among the most famous were Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Villa, commonly called Pancho Villa, who proved to be a brilliant military leader. Revolution and civil disorder in Mexico lasted many years, and by the late 1920s, Mexicans had become tired of the continual strife. Then, in 1929, General Plutarco Elias Calles formed an organization that eventually would become the Institutional Revolutionary Party, generally called the PRI, or PRI. PRI officials brought stability to the country, especially after millions of acres of land were returned to Indians and poor farmers, land that had been taken by the privileged wealthy class many years before. However, as time passed during its 72 years in power, many came to see the PRI as inefficient and corrupt. In response, PRI officials made many changes in the 1990s, including assurances of fair and free elections. But a majority of Mexicans saw their actions as too little, too late, and for the first time since 1910, elected their president from an opposition party. Newly elected President Vicente Fox immediately began to root out corruption, but he acknowledged it would be many years before Mexican citizens would live in a society free from official dishonesty and unfairness. Mexico is a federal republic with 31 states plus a federal district that includes Mexico City. There is a Congress composed of 2 chambers. The Senate has 2 senators from each state. They are elected for 6-year terms. The Chamber of Deputies has 500 members who have 3-year terms. Mexico's highest court, the Supreme Court of Justice, has 11 members whom the President appoints for 15-year terms. The real center of power in Mexico, however, is located within the presidential palace. From there, the President personally controls where the government spends much of its money. Of course, government spending often affects the Mexican people, the vast majority of whom are mestizos, or those of mixed heritage. Specifically, some of their ancestors came from Spain, some from Africa as slaves, and some were Native Americans. Being a mestizo is generally seen as a matter of pride. Mestizos see themselves as being descended from proud and accomplished peoples. Approximately 10% of Mexico's citizens count themselves as Indians. But to Mexicans, being an Indian is both a matter of ancestry and traditional ways of living. If a person speaks a Native American language, wears traditional clothing, lives in a traditional house near or in a village where many others consider themselves Indians, then they are Indian, even if they may have mixed ancestry. Because so many Mexicans have blended their Indian and Spanish heritages, Mexico has created one of the most colorful and interesting cultures in the Americas. That culture is reflected in many ways, including its various types of distinctive music. Mexican dances are also distinctive. The country's beautiful cathedrals reflect its unique culture too. and so does its public art. Mexico's people speak a form of Spanish that contains thousands of words taken from native languages. But about 5 million speak only their native language, of which there are more than 3 dozen. Most Mexicans, about 75%, live in towns or cities. Mexico is, in fact, a land of large metropolitan centers. It has 80 urban areas with more than 200,000 people, 11 of which have more than 1 million residents. Mexico City, with an estimated population of more than 20 million people in its metropolitan area, is, by some estimates, the world's largest city. The country's urban areas have grown rapidly in recent years because increasing numbers of people have moved to cities from the impoverished countryside to find work and a better life. 1/4 of all Mexicans, most very poor, live in rural areas. The majority of them are barely able to eke out a living. If and when they do move to a city, their living standards seldom improve, especially in bad economic times. With only a few years of schooling and no city skills, they generally live in the poorest neighborhoods, areas without electricity and running water, but sometimes plenty of dirty air. Air pollution is a serious problem in many of Mexico's big cities, including the capital, where some of the world's most polluted air is found. Even so, almost all urban areas in the country have modern high-rise buildings and examples of world-class modern architecture, some with distinctly Mexican characteristics. Museums, hospitals, and libraries, along with clean and orderly neighborhoods, are also found in Mexican cities. There, members of a growing middle class live much as their counterparts do in the U.S., Canada, and elsewhere. Regardless of class, almost all Mexicans enjoy the country's lively festivals. One of the most important, held in mid-September, commemorates the country's declaration of independence from Spain in 1810. In addition to Independence Day celebrations held throughout the country, another festival honoring Mexico's patron saint, Guadalupe, is an important religious holiday. Almost every town in Mexico has a holiday for its own patron saint too, often marked by elaborate displays. This one has been made from locally grown plants. Mexico is primarily a Roman Catholic country. More than 90% of all Mexicans are members of the Roman Catholic Church. Mexico, then, is a country with a long, rich, and turbulent history, one that dates back thousands of years when Native Americans roamed these lands, then later built some of the greatest cities of the ancient world. The story of Mexico also includes invasion and colonial domination by the Spanish. It is a story of revolution and conflict, but in more recent years, peace, growth, and renewal, and a government intent on meeting the country's challenges. Mexicans are, for the most part, descendants of both Spanish and native peoples, and they have a colorful and vibrant culture. Mexico, its history, government, and people, the story of our neighbors to the south.